We welcome everybody that's in the room and people that will be coming in and out, as well as our witness, the commissioner. Very important subject that we're going to talk with Commissioner McAleenan about. We thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. I and Senator Feinstein will have opening statements, and if Senator Cornyn and Durbin come, because they're chairman of the subcommittee, I'm going to give them a little bit of time to make comments as well. At the outset, I'd like to respectfully remind my colleagues that this hearing is about Customs and Border Protection Agency. This is absolutely not a general Homeland Security oversight hearing, and CBP is not the legislative body of the federal government. We in the Congress are. However, Customs and Border Protection is one of the premier federal law enforcement agencies. Its officers and agents are responsible for counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, border security, facilitating legitimate travel and trade, and processing both asylum seekers and unaccompanied alien children. All too often, the important work done by this agency's officers get lost in the current debate on immigration policy. Commissioner, when we met last week, I was pleased to hear how committed you are to securing our border, ensuring the safety of our Custom and Border Protection agents, as well as migrants and other travelers and the American people generally. Today's hearing is an opportunity for this committee to better understand the policies and actions of your agency. It's also an opportunity for you to explain to the American people the important role your agency plays in the day-to-day operations affecting our national security. Perhaps the timeliest issue before your agency is the ongoing conflict now at our Mexican border. We're also long overdue for aggressive increases in resources, technology, infrastructure, and personnel. For close to a decade now, we've seen record numbers of surges at the border. Fiscal year 18, over 396,000 individuals were apprehended at our southwest border, and 2 months into fiscal year 19, we've apprehended 102,000. This year alone, we've seen 3 separate instances of mass caravans making their way up to our country from the Northern Triangle. The most recent caravans, totaling around 10,000 people, have caught our attention for their propensity towards violence and aggression. Reports of hundreds of adult males throwing Molotov cocktails, rocks, and glass bottles at unarmed Mexican officials sends a message that the group marching towards America may not only be interested in peacefully seeking refuge and security. Every day, traffickers smuggle men, women, and children across our border, often subjecting them to physical and sexual assault while on the journey. Smugglers extort large sums of money from migrants and force them to pay debts even after they've arrived in the United States. Even now, in my home state of Iowa, I've received allegations that unaccompanied alien children are subjected to labor trafficking and forced to work on farms. Smugglers have developed a lucrative business preying on vulnerable migrants. They use legal loopholes like the restrictions on detaining families to entice parents to entrust them with their young children who are subjected to a harsh and long journey to the border. The smugglers, in turn, pair the children with the strangers so that they can be released as a family unit when apprehended at our border. In August, I sent a letter to Secretary Nielsen about a 13-year-old Guatemalan girl entrusted to a smuggler by her mother, understanding that they would be released into the United States if they presented themselves at the border as a family unit. The smuggler paired the girl with an unrelated male who lied to the Customs Border Patrol agents and said he was her father. Only after both were admitted to a hospital in California did authorities learn the smuggler had repeatedly raped and abused the girl. I've raised similar concerns dating back to 2015. It's not just smugglers. Sophisticated cartels and transnational criminal organizations also exploit vulnerabilities at the border. Since fiscal year 12, our agents' Office of Field Operations and the U.S. Border Patrol intercepted roughly 14 7/10 million pounds of cocaine, heroin, marijuana, meth, and fentanyl. This includes a 384% increase in fentanyl seizures over the past 2 years. And in the past 4 fiscal years, Border Patrol arrested over 3,800 gang members, nearly half of which were MS-13. The culmination of perceived vulnerabilities at the border and in our immigration laws can be seen in the most recent caravans of over 10,000 people traveling from Honduras and Guatemala. So we need to be clear, those who organize this effort have taken advantage of the economic insecurity of these people, the majority of whom are doing no more than trying to seek a better life. We sympathize with these people, and we welcome those who wish to enter our country but do it legally. We are a nation of laws, and for the safety of all, there must be order. The American people are a generous people, but they have also made clear that they don't want open borders. Our job in Congress is not just to complain, but to propose sound policies. That's why Senator Lee and I have urged the administration to execute a safe third country agreement and do that with Mexico that would allow asylum seekers to make their claims in the first country of arrival. Such an agreement would address concerns that I've raised about potential special interest aliens to mass themselves with in mass caravans. I'd add that this concern is one that we share with President Obama's own Homeland Security Secretary, Jay Johnson. A safe third-party agreement would also help address the desire of state of our asylum system. I said that wrong. A safe third country agreement would also help address the dire state of our asylum system. As you will well know and be aware of, our affirmative asylum backlog stands at about 320,000 cases, and our immigration asylum background is 348,000. And yet this is at a time when the CBP is processing record numbers of asylees. New numbers reported by the agency show 120% increase from fiscal 17 of asylum claims made at ports of entry alone. That doesn't account for the claims made between ports. So, Commissioner, I know you recently traveled to Guatemala to assess the situation. I hope you'll share what you learned there. Today, we will also discuss recent developments at the border and other reports involving the CBP. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for scheduling today's hearing. Commissioner, welcome. I look forward to hearing your testimony. First, let me say thank you for meeting with me. I found the meeting really a very fine one, and I felt we could work together, and I felt that you were sincere and forthright and really quite impressive. So thank you very, very much. I come from a border state, as we discussed, with a lot of traffic going back and forth, both legal and illegal. For over 3 months, from April through June, children and their parents were separated under a zero-tolerance policy. Unfortunately, given how that policy was implemented, there were problems keeping track of children and their parents. To address this, I've introduced a bill with 49 co-sponsors, the Keep Families Together Act, that would end the separation of families. My bill would prevent families from being separated unless parental rights were terminated or the parent was a danger to the child. The bill would also provide specialized child welfare training to people making these decisions. I hope this is something we can work together on and that you will support the Keep Family Together Act. We briefly discussed the use of tear gas on the border, and last month, mothers and children, some as young as toddlers in diapers, attempted to cross the border in California at San Ysidro, but tear gas was fired at their group. As you know, this particular gas cannot be aimed with precision, so while the goal may have been to disperse a crowd attempting to cross the border, children were harmed in the process. So we need to work together to make sure this doesn't happen again. And I'm going to ask you about your position with respect to the Border Patrol and the use of gas at the border. I hope we can discuss ways to help asylum seekers present themselves in a safe, orderly way, and I believe we can. Unfortunately, the President deployed military troops along the border. This deployment is costly, unlawful, and unnecessary. In fact, the cost has already reached $72 million. But a more significant consequence is that on November 20th, the administration authorized troops to use force, including lethal force, against migrants. This is in clear violation of U.S. law. Specifically, the Posse Comitatus Act prohibits federal troops from performing civilian law enforcement, such as enforcing United States immigration laws or border security. Therefore, by defining the troops' protection mission too broadly to include the use of lethal force where necessary to enforce border security, the administration's November 20 order, I think, violates the Posse Comitatus Act. While there's broad bipartisan agreement that our immigration system needs modifications, I hope that you and this committee can agree that current policies are not as workable as they should be. So going forward, I hope we can work collaboratively to keep families together. Commissioner, again, thank you for coming to testify here today, but also thank you for the time that you spent with me, and I look forward to many more discussions and trying to be, as a border state senator, as helpful as I can. So thank you very much.
Senator Cornyn and Senator Durbin, if you care, chairman of the subcommittees.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here. You have one of the most difficult jobs in the U.S. government, and which is to make sure that America remains safe and secure from threats while facilitating legitimate trade and commerce with our international partners. I know there's some people would like to look at the border through a soda straw and pretend like it's just one issue. As you know, it's much more complicated than that, and CBP has to somehow navigate that complexity. It's easy for people to blame or attempt to shame CBP publicly for what is currently happening on the border, but the truth is much of it is a result of Congress's inaction in dealing with our broken immigration system and the fact that the cartels, the transnational criminal organizations that facilitate the movement of migrants, drugs, and trafficking in human beings across the borders, this is a business for them, as you know, and it's not fair, nor is it accurate, I think, to blame the U.S. government officials who are simply doing what we ask you to do, consistent with the current law, when Congress itself has not stepped up and provided the tools necessary for you to do it in a better way. The scope of CBP's mission is not limited to dealing with caravans of migrants, as you know. You also screen millions of international travelers each year at the air, sea, and land ports of entry, scan cargo bound for the United States from foreign ports, and work hand in hand with private sector partners to ensure that this is done safely, securely, and efficiently. This afternoon, thanks to the Chairman's agreement, I am going to conduct a hearing, as you may know, that will highlight how insidious and pervasive these transnational criminal organizations are, including gangs and drug cartels. One of the greatest threats to U.S. national security, in my view, is the trafficking of drugs. As you know, about 90% of the heroin, which is an opioid, people are concerned about the opioid crisis, but tend to focus on prescription drugs and not the cheaper substitute that comes, 90% of which comes from Mexico. But this is a huge public health problem. CDC, the Center for Disease Control, estimated about 72,000 Americans died of an overdose last year, about 50,000, as I recall, from some form of opioid, either fentanyl, a synthetic drug, or heroin, or prescription drugs. I can't imagine why there isn't more of an outcry about this crisis at the border and more recognition of the role of these transnational criminal organizations, because it seems to be more narrow and more political and more ideological a focus, and one that does not serve the best interests of the country. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing your testimony and the answers to our questions.
Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner McAleenan, it's nice to see you again. When we met in my office about a year ago, I said, hey, blank slate, blank check. What do you need? And you gave me a list of things that were priorities, and they were focused on technology and personnel. They did not include a wall, I might tell you. The number one item on your wish list, more drive-through inspection systems, something I didn't know much about and have since learned, the so-called Z portal system that basically scans or x-rays vehicles and containers that are coming across the border so you can detect whether there's anything suspicious included. I heard your message, and I thought it was a good one, because I am for border security, as I believe most members of Congress are. For 4 months, I worked with my colleagues on a bipartisan immigration agreement. We specifically included your top priorities, the ones you identified to me. We increased funding for Z portal scanning devices. We increased hiring and retention incentives for your personnel. We put port of entry infrastructure and personnel as a priority. We had funding for biometric entry and exit screening and many other things that we believed that your professionals agreed with you are part of keeping our border safe. On February 15th of this year, a bipartisan majority of the Senate supported our agreement, but it didn't reach 60 votes because the president opposed it. On the same day, a bipartisan supermajority of the Senate rejected the president's own immigration plan. This fall, the president tried to rally his base before the election, just a few days, over a caravan of immigrants headed to our border. But the reality is this caravan started on the president's watch. His administration is not addressing the root causes that have created this migrant movement toward the United States. Instead, the administration has cut security and humanitarian assistance by more than 1/3 to Central America. He has terminated the temporary protected status for El Salvadorans and Hondurans, which would force more than 250,000 of people from the United States back to these countries. And he shut down, in many respects, the legal avenues for migration, like the Central American Minor Program, where minors in these 3 countries that are sending so many people to our border could have applied for asylum in their countries without making this dangerous journey to our border. This administration eliminated that program, which gave these minors and their parents few options, and one, sadly, was to trek to our border and to face what they're facing today. The history of this issue is clear. A bipartisan group put together a measure and brought it to the Senate floor a few years ago that would have provided $40 billion in border security. That funding had the support of a bipartisan majority in the Senate, but it was never taken up or considered by the Republican House. So we want border security, but we want smart border security that serves our nation's needs. Democrats support it, and we stand ready to work on a bipartisan immigration reform legislation, but we're not going to support the administration's hardline agenda, which would slash legal immigration and family reunification, and unfortunately dramatically cut protections for women and children fleeing persecution. Thank you.
Number one, I'm going to introduce you. Number two, I'll administer oath. And number three, you'll have 7 minutes for your opening statement. Is that okay? The commissioner started in this position March 20th, 2018. He oversees 60,000 employees, manages a budget of $13 billion, ensures the effective operations of Customs Border Patrol efforts to protect national security, promote economic prosperity and security. The Commissioner directs CBP's 3 core missions: counterterrorism, border security, and trade enforcement. He oversees the largest law enforcement agency and the second largest revenue collecting source in the federal government. In 2015, he received a Presidential Rank Award, the nation's highest civil service award. Congratulations. Do you affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God? I do. Thank you. Proceed with your statement.
Good morning, and thank you. Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein, and members of the committee. It's a privilege to appear before you today. U.S. Customs and Border Protection's counterterrorism, border security, trade enforcement, agriculture protection, and trade and travel facilitation missions are essential to U.S. homeland and economic security. With over 60,000 professionals working to protect the American people every day, it is my honor to serve alongside them as Commissioner. Over the past year, we've made strides across almost every area of our mission. We have facilitated record levels of trade and travel, interdicted increasing quantities of hard narcotics, enhanced screening and vetting, implemented the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, and continued our commitment to ensure our officers and agents are safe as they carry out their critical duties and have the best training, policy, and equipment. The list goes on, and I'm very fortunate to have a tremendous leadership team and a dedicated and innovative workforce at CBP to make progress across all these key areas. Within CBP's broad responsibility, I recognize that our border security mission and our immigration enforcement efforts are of the greatest interest to this committee. Here we have made great strides as well. CBP's ability to detect and interdict illegal border crossings has never been higher. We are putting initial investments in border wall system to good use and have already built critical sections of modern wall in key border areas where it has made an immediate impact. We have turned around our hiring and ended the last fiscal year with almost 500 more frontline officers and agents. We maintain the most capable civilian law enforcement air and marine operations in the world and are accelerating the development and deployment of cutting-edge technology to our workforce. And we've extended our shared zone of security through enhanced international partnerships and capacity building throughout the hemisphere and beyond. That is not to say we do not face challenges in our border security mission. Clearly, the increased smuggling of heroin, fentanyl, and other synthetic opioids, along with growing rates of methamphetamine that are devastating communities across the United States, remains a critical focus. And at the border, we face changing trends in illegal crossings that impact security, exploit our laws, and challenge our resources and personnel. To put this aspect of our mission in context, one day of crossings, last Monday, December 3rd, highlights the trends that we are confronting. On that day, we saw the highest numbers of arrivals at our southwest border in years. 3,029 illegal entries and inadmissible persons arrived at our border last Monday. 85% of them crossed illegally. CBP apprehended or encountered 1,731 members of family groups and 350 unaccompanied children. This means that the illegal crossings and inadmissibles last Monday included over 1,100 children in a single day. This snapshot is emblematic of the steady trends that we've been seeing for many months, increasing crossings overall, with a dramatic surge in the percentage of family units and a growing proportion of Central Americans coming to our border. More broadly, for the last 30 days, we've seen over 2,000 unlawful entries between ports and undocumented arrivals at ports of entry each day. Over 1,070 family members are arriving on a consistent basis. To put this in perspective, we will more than double last year's record number of family units at this rate. I've heard a number of commentators observe that even at these levels, the numbers we are seeing are lower than historical peaks, and as a result, they suggest what we are seeing at the border today is not a crisis. I fundamentally disagree with this assessment. From the experience of our agents and officers on the ground, it is indeed both a border security and a humanitarian crisis. What many looking at the total numbers fail to understand is the difference in what is happening now in terms of who is crossing, the risks that they are facing in the journey, and the consequences for our system. First, up until this decade, most of those crossing the border illegally were single adult males. Now the majority crossing are family units and unaccompanied children. This was fewer than 10% up until the year 2012. 59% of crossings last month were families and unaccompanied children. Second, migration from Mexico remains at historically low levels, while the majority of illegal border crossings now come from 3 countries of Central America: Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Central America has now exceeded Mexican migration 4 out of the last 5 years and reached 70% of crossings last month. November was the first month in recorded history where more people arrived from another country than Mexico, with Guatemala exceeding Mexico by 3,000. The third major trend is a dramatic increase in claims of fear of return, or asylum claims. Between 2000 and 2013, fewer than 1% of those encountered at our border claimed asylum. Last year at ports of entry, the number of asylum claims more than doubled to 38,269. Nearly 31% of those deemed inadmissible at ports of entry claimed asylum. These increases in demographic changes in crossings are direct responses to the vulnerabilities in our legal framework that have become well known to smugglers and migrants. These weaknesses in our laws now represent the most significant factors impacting border security, and they include the asylum gap, where approximately 80% of individuals meet the initial credible fear bar in the asylum process, while only 10 to 20% are found to have valid asylum claims at the end of their immigration court proceedings. The disparate treatment under the Trafficking Victims Protection and Reauthorization Act, still a critical statute, but it allows for children arriving from Mexico and Canada to be repatriated, but not from other countries, including those in Central America. And the inability to keep families together while they complete expeditious and fair immigration proceedings. Instead, crossing with a child is a near guarantee of a speedy release. These deficiencies ensure a high likelihood of success, and the trends they invite have significant ramifications. First, our infrastructure is incompatible with this reality. Our Border Patrol stations and ports of entry were built to handle mostly male single adults in custody, not families or children. Second, the illegal crossings have a much different character, with families and children coming across in large groups and simply presenting themselves to Border Patrol agents. The smugglers are choosing the timing and location for these crossings strategically in order to disrupt our border security efforts, create a diversion for smuggling of narcotics, and allow single adults seeking to evade capture to sneak in. Even worse, these smugglers visit horrible violence, sexual assault, and extortion on some of the most vulnerable people in our hemisphere. And lastly, these trends mean that regardless of whether an individual who has entered illegally has a valid case for protection or asylum, they are increasingly unlikely to be repatriated. Indeed, only 1.5% of family units from Central America apprehended over a full fiscal year ago in 17 have been removed to their countries of origin, despite the fact that most will not end up having valid claims to remain in the U.S. when their court proceedings conclude. That perception that our system will allow them to stay in the U.S. indefinitely is clearly the driving pull factor for those making the journey to our border, along with important push factors, which include challenging conditions in many parts of Central America. This incentivizes them to put their lives in the hands of smugglers and make the dangerous trek north to the southwest border. The cost of these pull and push factors is seen every day in profits derived by TCOs and lives lost on the journey, and in the loss of youth and energy from the countries of the Northern Triangle. This is clearly both a border security and a humanitarian crisis. There are solutions to this crisis, and many of them have broad support. We need to continue to support the governments of Central America to improve economic opportunities, to address poverty and hunger, and to improve governance and security. We must work with the new administration in Mexico on addressing transnational criminal organizations that prey on migrants, and we must invest in border security, including a modern border wall system, additional technology at ports of entry, additional agents and officers, and air and marine support. All of these steps will make a difference. But we must also confront and address the vulnerabilities in our legal framework for lasting change at the border. As we engage in discussion of CBP's Border Security and Immigration missions today, I urge the committee to consider the acute need for legislative action with this backdrop. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to the committee's questions.
5-minute round questions, and there's a vote at 11. It's my intention to keep the meeting going so people can take their turn. I'll probably be gone 7 or 8 minutes, and just keep the meeting going according to the either seniority or arrival, however it's done. My first question. On November 25, 1,000 migrants in a caravan ignored and overwhelmed Mexican law enforcement and attempted to breach our border at Port of Entry, San Diego. Agitators in the group rushed the port, hurling rocks, bottles, debris, and other projectiles at your officers guarding a fence. In response, the agents deployed non-lethal tear gas to control the agitators and close the port of entry. As you know, Commissioner, this incident has been criticized and even mischaracterized by the media and others, but the use of tear gas is unprecedented. I have these statistics. CBP employed tear gas a total of 126 times since 2012. That includes 79 times between 2012 and 2016 under President Obama. Nobody wants to see children and women hurt. Nobody wants to see migrants, travelers, or even our agents hurt. That's why I'm happy to hear that your agency's use of firearm decreased 69% since 2012 to a record low this year. Unfortunately, assaults against your personnel has increased 45% to 847 times in fiscal year 2017. So I want you to give you an opportunity to explain to the committee and the American people what happened on November 25th. So 4 parts that I'm going to read all at once so you don't have to answer short questions. Who initiated the conflict? Did your agency intentionally target women and children? What were the agent's options? And did this incident deviate from standard protocol? And is there an investigation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. November 25th, we faced a dynamic and challenging situation in Tijuana, no question. We had over 1,000 migrants who were marching toward the Mexican side of the port of entry, El Chaparral, and pushed through the Mexican federal police lines there, and then started a chaotic attempt to enter the U.S. through both the port of entry on the Mexican side and then ultimately through different areas of weak points along the fence line in San Diego sector. This was a 2.5-mile stretch of border that large groups attempted to penetrate at multiple points over the course of about a 4 or 5 hour stretch. Importantly, due to the help of the Department of Defense, who put barriers in place in the southbound lanes very quickly after we saw this group forming and push past Mexican federal police, we're able to shut down access through the southbound lanes in the United States. So they were deterred and turned around. Unfortunately, they then sought weak points along the fence line. And throughout the next 5 hours, we saw large groups entering the United States through weak points in the legacy fence. It's actually being replaced right now, thanks to the investments in fiscal year 17. We've already built 33 out of those 40 miles. We're putting the rest in place now. They were assaultive in their behavior. They threw rocks at agents. We had an agent who now has to have surgery for a dislocated patella. He was hit by a rock during this event. And the agents were in challenging spaces. First, the Tijuana River Channel, where you've seen a lot of photography and video of over 500 migrants who were seeking to enter en masse through that area. And then in the border zone, where we have a primary fence and then a secondary fence, where there's very little room to maneuver or back up. So our agents were in a difficult situation. To answer your specific questions, who initiated this contact, it was initiated by some of the agitators and lead organizers of this group. Whether women and children were intentionally targeted with less lethal gas and pepper spray, absolutely not. The agitators who were throwing rocks were the ones targeted. Whether this was within protocols, yes, in fact, in our use of force continuum, pepper spray and CS gas are authorized to address assaultive behavior or even active resistance, which was certainly occurring in this case. And is there an investigation and review? Yes, we have for all incidents of use of force. We have a use of force review board. This is being pursued under the auspices of San Diego Sector, requested by Chief Rodney Scott, who oversees the agents involved, with support of our National Office of Professional Responsibility and our Law Enforcement Safety and Compliance Division. I think it's remarkable, Senator, that our agents were able to resolve the situation without a serious injury to any of the migrants, without a serious breach of the border by a large group. And I think it was done very professionally, and we're going to take any lessons learned from this review and apply them in the future.
Senator Feinstein.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. While we're on the subject of tear gas being used, has CBP ever fired tear gas at young children on the border prior to November 25th?
Just to clarify, Senator, we did not fire tear gas at young children on November 25th. But yes, CS gas has been used to address large groups seeking to enter unlawfully, actually in San Diego Sector in the same exact area, almost 5 years to the day, a large group that did include women and children in it as well.
Well, CBP's use of force manual, as I understand it, does not specifically authorize tear gassing young children. Do you think CBP needs to make any changes to its use of force policies to make sure that children are not harmed going forward?
So, first of all, no, of course, our policy does not authorize tear gassing young children, nor did that happen, just to say that again in this case.
Well, I can show you a picture that was on CNN.
No, I understand. There's lots of, the full description of this situation will come out in the review, and we'll be transparent about the findings from that. Our use of force policy has been rigorously reviewed. It was built on recommendations from the Police Executive Research Forum, and it's resulted, as the chairman noted, in significant improvements across the board. I would offer that I don't think any law enforcement agency in the U.S. has made more progress in the training and the tactics used by our officers and agents than CBP. In 2012, we had 55 uses of force with a firearm. In 2018, we had 15, despite increasing numbers of apprehensions and assaults. So we're making tremendous progress in this area.
Who authorizes the use of tear gas in your agency?
So law enforcement use of force is driven by the circumstances that an officer or agent encounters in the field during their mission. They're looking at a totality of the circumstances,
yes, but
the threat presented.
What position is charged with giving the direction to use it?
So the direction to use it is not given from a top-down chain of command perspective. The use of less lethal devices is authorized. We then have agents trained and certified. They're allowed to carry those devices, but the individual agent on the scene makes the decision on whether to deploy a less lethal device to address the situation.
So what you're saying is on the 25th, one agent made the decision to use tear gas. How many agents used tear gas?
That's all being reviewed in the overall review, and more than one agent made that decision based on the risk and threat they were presented with in, again, multiple different engagements across about 2.5 miles of border.
Well, the picture that I have that ran on CNN shows a mother pulling a child, the second child on her other arm with a diaper, and tear gas rolling in behind them. And I think that's not a picture or an act that befits this country.
I respect that view, Senator. It's very unfortunate that women and children were in the vicinity of this large group that was trying to enter the United States. I don't know that picture accurately tells the full story of the scope of events on that Sunday.
I'm sure it does not, but nonetheless, that's what was photographed. And I think that's the realization of the use. And you yourself pointed out the large number of children and increase in numbers over the years. And that's one of our great concerns. But I want to go on, and I want to ask you about the separation of children from their parents. I know Border Patrol doesn't have a lot to do with it, but how many children have been separated from their parents at the border since June 20th?
So by the U.S. Border Patrol, approximately 81. So less than one a day.
Have any children been separated solely because their parents entered the United States without a visa?
No.
Are you aware of any discussions or efforts to develop a new family separation policy?
No, I'm not. And just to clarify, these separations are done consistent with the guidance in the executive order of June 20th, consistent with the court order in the Miss L case. They are for child welfare. We're talking about examples of a parent wanted for murder, a parent who's had a stroke and needs to be taken to the emergency room. Those are the kind of situations where children are being separated at the border. It's for child welfare or a parent who's unable to take care of the child.
Well, those aren't the only situations where they've been separated.
Since June 20th.
As I mentioned to you, my understanding is they're building 4 separate places to house children in California alone now. So something's going on that says that children are being taken from their parents.
We're unable to confirm that, Senator. I did have our Congressional Affairs team reach out to HHS to make sure they connected with your staff, but we're not aware of any additional child centers being built in California.
I'll get that information. I'd like to go and see them myself. What is Border Patrol's standard for determining whether separation is in the best interest of the child?
We go through the criteria laid out in both the executive order and the Miss L court order. So we're looking for a serious criminal offense that needs to be pursued or prosecuted, a child welfare concern, potentially a history of sexual abuse by the adult that's involved in the family unit, again, a communicable disease or other medical condition that prevents the parent from being able to care for the child.
Senator Cornyn.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner, from where I sit, it looks to me like the transnational criminal organizations, sometimes we refer to them as drug cartels, but they do a whole lot more illegal activity. It looks to me like they're winning.
I think they're making a tremendous profit off the backs of very, very vulnerable people right now. $2.5 billion for human smuggling.
I've read that the average cost for transporting a Central American to the United States and trying to place them in the United States is roughly $8,000. Is that within the ballpark?
That is. We're looking at 5 to 10,000, 7 to 8 on average, and increasing every year.
So it's quite a profitable business for them, correct?
Absolutely.
And Congress could fix the problem of family units and unaccompanied minors by simply treating countries from non-contiguous countries the same way we treat immigration from, let's say, Mexico, correct?
Yeah, there are several legislative changes that can make a big impact in this flow.
One of those is the Humane Act that Representative Henry Cuellar and I have introduced in a number of different times, but we can't seem to get much interest in actually a legislative solution. And in the meantime, the cartels continue to win. You heard me mention the fact that last year the CDC said about 70,000 Americans died of drug overdoses. I think about 50,000 of those are from opioids, either fentanyl, synthetic, or heroin, or prescription drugs that are being abused. Would you agree with my estimate that about 90% of the heroin that makes its way into the United States comes from Mexico across the southwestern border?
Yes, it's more than 90%.
And you pointed out that this gap that's being exploited by these criminal organizations in terms of transporting family units and unaccompanied children are used as a strategic diversion by the cartels, because when Border Patrol and our other government officials are tied up basically trying to process large numbers of people at the border, it leaves an opening or gap in our defenses that are exploited by the drug cartels. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And for those of us who come from border states, but I would argue for all Americans who benefit from legitimate trade and commerce across our border, when these caravans or when large numbers of people show up at the border and block the ports of entry, that essentially prevents that legitimate trade and commerce from occurring, does it not? I believe that happened at the San Isidro Bridge in Tijuana, between Tijuana and San Diego.
It does. During this incident on November 25th, we had to shut the port for about 5 hours to prevent a large rush. And that was very costly. It was, Sunday of the Black Friday weekend. There was a shopping mall right there in San Isidro that put out a press release that they lost $5.5 million of business during that 5 hours alone.
And you call this a pull factor. In other words, when the cartels are successful in placing people into the United States, taking advantage of these gaps in our laws, this is something that actually encourages further illegal immigration into the United States, does it not?
Yes. I mean, if you're very likely to be allowed to stay in the U.S. indefinitely, that's a huge incentive to try to come unlawfully.
And you pointed out that the gap that they've also figured out is to make an asylum claim, and that used to not be common, but now it is common. Is it your belief that these migrants who come into the United States are coached to say the magic words to basically invoke our laws governing asylum?
Yeah, I think the dramatic increase is explained by both smugglers and migrants' awareness that it's a good way to be allowed to stay in the United States.
Recently, we've read that the administration, I think Secretary Nielsen and perhaps others, maybe Secretary Pompeo, have been negotiating with the incoming administration of President Lopez Obrador toward an agreement that would allow these asylum seekers to stay in Mexico while their claims are being processed in the United States. Can you tell us what the status of that is?
So I wouldn't want to get ahead of any diplomatic discussions at the cabinet level, Senator, but I can tell you we've had very good dialogue with the incoming team of President Lopez Obrador, very committed to working together on the shared migration problem in the region, and very optimistic about partnering with them.
Well, I understand your reluctance of getting ahead of an announcement, an official announcement, but it strikes me that if such an agreement is struck, that represents a historic moment in our relationship with Mexico as regards the migration challenges and the fact that they would actually offer asylum to some of the Central Americans in Mexico, the fact that they would offer work permits to them and agree to allow them to stay there while their asylum claims are being processed in the United States is quite a coup. And so I would congratulate those in the administration that are responsible. That's a big step. Thank you.
Let me give a heads up. On the Republican side, Flake and Lee would be the next two. And on the Democrat side, it's Leahy now and then Durbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was listening to this, and I was recently at the Hidalgo port of entry. I saw the practice of metering. CBP limits the number of asylum claims to process because of space and resource. Now, at this major port, about 12 million people pass through there each year, 12 million. And your agency recently said they'd process only 50. DHS Inspector General report from September, a very recent one, found evidence that strongly suggests that metering at ports of entry increases illegal crossings between ports. Do you agree with your Inspector General that metering pushes asylum seekers to attempt to enter the country illegally?
So the practice of queue management center, and thank you for visiting us at Hidalgo, where we've got a very hardworking staff that's processing a number of...
I was very impressed with the staff. Policy I have a little problem with, but the staff I was very impressed with them.
Understood. At Hidalgo today, for instance, and this is a report I get every day, that there aren't any people waiting in line. We have about 5 in custody that are being processed that have arrived without documents. But this is something we monitor and manage every day. We want to encourage people to present lawfully at ports of entry, even if they don't have documents, even if they need to make an asylum claim.
General?
So the Inspector General was covering a period of time in June when the data did suggest that was possible, and talking about specific interviews with agents that had one or two different family groups state that they had been waiting and decided to cross illegally. So I accept their conclusion on that point.
When I was there, the waiting room I saw at Hidalgo Point of Entry was empty. Do you have daily limits?
We don't have daily limits. This is a discretionary balance by the port director assessing their mission requirements to process lawful trade and travel, to address our counter-narcotics mission, and to process people arriving without documents. And so they do that on a daily basis with discretion down to their leadership team.
What's the total number of claims that CBP allows a day along the southwest border?
Senator, it varies. It varies depending on how many people we have in custody at the ports of entry. I can tell you last year it was almost 39,000 claims, over 120% increase at ports of entry, and we've gone up again 100% from last year in the first 2 months of this fiscal year. So we are providing access to asylum seekers at ports of entry. We're dedicated to that.
I'm wearing my hat as Vice Chairman of the Appropriations Committee. I noticed that we provided $1.7 billion to the administration to build or replace fencing on the southern border, but only 6% of that money has been spent. There's been almost no construction. Project costs have ballooned. One project in the Rio Grande Valley has ballooned in cost from $445 million to $787 million. Price tag of $31.5 million per mile. The president's trying to shut down the government unless taxpayers come up with another $5 billion. When 94% of the money funding has been provided remains unspent, does it really make sense to be shutting down the government, asking for more money when you haven't spent the money you have?
If I could just first quickly comment on the fact, I think that might be outdated data that you're referencing, Senator. But by the end of this month, we're going to have $1.27 billion out of the $1.7 appropriated in 17 and 18 obligated for the wall.
Obligated but not spent.
Well, we've built 33 out of 40 miles in fiscal year 17. And when I talk about obligated, that's spent. That's on contract with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
I'm going to give you some questions for the record, which I hope you'll answer as we'll have time, because I have one other question. I also live on a border state. I'm an hour's drive from the Canadian border. CBP is using kind of dragnet vehicle checkpoints throughout the interior of Vermont. Most Vermonters don't carry their passports. But when you board a Greyhound bus or stop a car just outside of Burlington, there's a feeling that may be racial profiling. And I will admit it's not all racial profiling. I got stopped 75 miles from the Canadian border. When I asked the Border Patrol officer by what authority he was stopping me, he patted his gun. He said, that's all the authority I needed. Now, it did change a little bit when the supervisor came around the corner and saw the license plate of my car, which is 1. And it calmed down a little bit. But most Vermonters don't have that. People have been late for work and everything else. They've having to prove they're citizens. They haven't gone anywhere near the border. Does that make any sense? And especially when there are long lines sometimes at the Canadian border just because there's not enough manpower. Does it make sense to be running around a state like Vermont and climbing on buses and telling people, prove you're a citizen?
Well, Senator, checkpoints and operations on transportation that are on routes of egress away from the border are an important border security tool. We made 8,000 apprehensions last year with those tools. In Vermont, it's pretty rare that we use checkpoints, usually intelligence-driven. 75 miles away might seem like a long way away, but we're actually trying to target an area where the transportation nodes come together, and there's a route of egress into the U.S.
Senator Flake.
I got targeted, and I just would note that you have to be a citizen to be a U.S. Senator.
Of course.
Senator Flake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You started to address the use of metering. Can you explain what that means?
It's actually, we call it queue management. We're balancing based on our capacity, based on our responsibility to manage lawful trade and travel, to carry out our counter-narcotics mission, our other security missions, our agriculture protection mission, and still process people arriving without documents efficiently. On any given day, there are only 3 to 4 ports of entry out of the 26 on our southwest border that actually have any backup at all. Meanwhile, we have maximize the use of our capacity, our space, and of course it depends on our partners' ability, ICE bed space, ICE resources to pick people up from ports of entry. It's a partnership in the immigration continuum.
So it's used just as a management tool, queue management, rather than a deterrent.
Correct. We want people to present lawfully at ports of entry. I can't overemphasize that.
Right. Do you have any information on, there is a concern of some, and I share it, that maybe driving individuals who were metered, I guess, at a port of entry to go between and cross illegally between ports of entry. What information do you have on how, if that is happening, and how frequent?
Yeah, Senator Leahy referenced the IG report where that was cited based on 2 interviews with agents who had heard that from family groups they had apprehended. That's certainly a concern. It's certainly something that we want people to wait lawfully, even if it has to take some period of time. That's the appropriate and safe way to cross the border. You don't have to pay a smuggler that way. And we see so many injuries, so many deaths, unfortunately, for people that try to cross illegally in the hands of a smuggler.
Right. But do you have any information, or the people who register, I assume they sign some document as they are metered at a port of entry, how many of them then turn up being apprehended between ports of entry?
Yeah, they actually don't sign a document. They're not recorded when they approach the line the initial time. They're allowed to wait there if they would like. So we don't have that fidelity and being able to compare that.
Thank you. In a report issued with regard to family reunification in September, the Office of Attorney General found a lack of integration between CPP, ICE, and HHS's information technology systems. That was part of the problem in terms of reunification of families. What has been done to address that issue?
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate issue. That's something we work very hard with ICE and with HHS, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which manages this process to ensure that we're sharing information effectively. I would note that because Border Patrol agents carefully track who's encountered together, even though it doesn't automatically upload at this time, we're going to work on that to the HHS system. They were able to identify relationships between parents and children and reunite them. So it's not as easy as it needs to be, but there is a system in place. They just need to look at multiple databases.
So it's not a resource issue in terms of appropriation to be able to integrate those systems, or are you doing it as quickly as you need to?
We're doing it as quickly as we need to, and we'll certainly let the committee know and the Appropriations Committee know if we need additional resource support.
According to the September report, the Inspector General report as well, CBP does not use DNA testing to verify that adults claiming to be the parents of children are really the parents. Why aren't we doing that, at least the rapid DNA testing?
Yeah, that's a real concern, especially with the smuggler's awareness that crossing with a child is a good way to be allowed to stay and be released into the United States. We identified over 600 families that had fraudulent claims essentially last year where the adult and child weren't related. Actually, Senator Booker's not here, but when he was down with me at the Central Processing Center, there was a 4-month-old where the smuggler admitted to being paid to bring the child across and not have a relationship. So what we do that through interview. CBP is intended to be that initial border security interdiction and really a very short-term custody before transfer to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so that, we're looking at DNA at that level, at the DHS level, to be applied in the ICE facilities. And if necessary, on certain high-risk cases, we could explore it as well.
All right. Well, thank you. I wanted to thank you for working with our office and others to make the hiring process more rapid in terms of agents on the border. That has helped, is my understanding, and so I appreciate the work of your office on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Durbin, if the vote comes right at 11, I'm going to go vote, and then Senator Feinstein will call on people while I'm gone, and then I'll come back.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Commissioner, there was a news story a few months ago which was very troubling. and it said that for the first time in almost a century, life expectancy in the United States, life expectancy is going down. And the reason, of course, is the drug epidemic, a drug epidemic which is taking tens of thousands of lives all across the United States, in the cities and small towns, rural areas. And of course, we know that one of the drivers in this deadly drug epidemic is fentanyl. Fentanyl is, and its analogs were the cause of 2/3 of the more than 42,000 opioid deaths in the United States in 2016. The source of most illicit fentanyl, Mr. Commissioner, and the underlying chemical precursors is from China via international mail, which of course is part of your responsibility in monitoring that mail. Fentanyl is also being shipped from China to Mexico, to a lesser degree Canada, before being trafficked across the U.S. border, primarily through illegal ports of entry. I know the President wants to focus on the families coming from 3 countries in Central America, and they should be focused on. These are human beings who should be treated in a humane fashion. But I want to ask you this. Why are we focusing on building a $5 billion wall when your resources and technology, by your own admission, is not up to the task of stopping the flow of fentanyl into the United States? Let me give you a couple things to point to. The Z portal technology, which you told me for the first time, explained it to me and how good it was and how important it was. At this current moment, the so-called non-intrusive inspection systems are used to examine 98% of rail cars, but only 18% of arrival cargo, passenger vehicles, and sea containers combined. Yet the President's budget only asks for $44 million for these systems in the next year. So let me say, can you focus, instead of on these families for a moment, focus on fentanyl? And tell me why this administration and why you aren't asking for more technology to stop the flow of deadly fentanyl into the United States, which has gone so far as to lower the life expectancy of Americans.
We're extremely concerned, Senator, about hard narcotics, fentanyl, methamphetamine. One of the front lines, as you note, for this substance to enter our country is right there at your mail facility at O'Hare in your state.
I've been there.
You've been there, I know, thank you. We, with the Interdict Act, with the STOP Act, we appreciate very much the support of Congress on this mission. We've had additional investments in our ability to detect fentanyl and our ability to test for it. We have asked for additional non-intrusive inspection technology.
$44 million. This President's asking for $5 billion for a wall which a ladder or a tunnel can overcome. And yet we have deadly fentanyl coming in for the worst drug epidemic in our history. Where is the passion for this? I think that'd be something to be the first request of your agency when it comes to protecting America.
I can promise you the passion and commitment here and with my men and women in the field is absolute for our counter-narcotics mission.
But the budget request doesn't reflect that passion whatsoever. It's all about the wall.
Senator, we did provide technical assistance to the appropriations committees in the House and the Senate on increasing the amount of non-intrusive inspection to include the drive-through systems that we talked about. That's going to help us increase our ability, if we're able to get that into the appropriations bill.
What about the Z portals? 18% of the vehicles coming into the United States,
right,
aside from rail cars, 18% are being scanned. Is that the best we can do?
No, I agree with you. We need to dramatically increase the percentage.
And how much money does it take for the scanning so that we can find contraband, narcotics, weapons, other things coming in? What do you need? How much money?
Well, we've provided that technical assistance to the appropriators. It's multi-year investment in the $300+ million range to achieve that.
$300 million?
$300 million a year for several years to get to that level.
That's a heck of a lot less than $5 billion.
Well, sir, the wall is also very important because we've got increased hard narcotics coming between ports of entry, 25% increase last year.
And you want walls, a concrete wall? Is that what you're looking for?
Not concrete. We're looking for a steel bollard wall with a modern wall system with cameras, sensors, and access roads.
Right, technology. Well, of course, we're on board for most of that, and we want to talk about expanding it. But I wish you were just as passionate about fentanyl as you are about these families. That's all they talk about, these families that show up at the border. The fentanyl is killing Americans.
I agree.
Innocent Americans every day addicted are dying because of this fentanyl, and it's your agency's responsibility.
along
You
with
have to
U.S.
put resources into this, and we need requests from you that focus on that as well. Let me say a word about the so-called asylum gap, where you said 80% know how to say the right words, credible fear, and so forth, and yet only 10 to 20% of them end up being in a position where they qualify for asylum status. Would you concede, in another question you were asked by Senator Cornyn, well, how do they happen to be at 80% levels of saying the right words? And you said because of smugglers and migrants' awareness of what the legal system is. I think you left out an element there. Aren't we also dealing with 3 countries in Central America that are virtually in shambles when it comes to law enforcement, or some of the most dangerous places in our hemisphere?
So all 3 countries have significant challenges with security, but all have improved dramatically over the last 2 years. The murder rates have gone down significantly in Honduras and El Salvador. That violence does not explain the current flows alone.
Well, it's interesting that the flows from those countries, those smaller countries, are greater than Mexico at this point. And I don't think that's coincidental. Let me read you a quote here, which you said last year. The U.S. needs to invest in Central American governance efforts and their economic development and their security against gangs, smugglers, drug cartels, and so forth to help prevent the push factor from which exists in those countries and to help support their economic development. Do you still believe that?
I do. I said it in my opening as well.
So you believe that the administration's cutback in resources for these countries is making the situation worse instead of better?
Actually, seeing our men and women down there, the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Agency of International Development, apply the funds to good effect in key areas of these 3 countries, I'm very inspired by the difference we can make with this aid.
Inspiring but underpaid.
Senator Feinstein, could I just have 1 second to talk about our mail facility investments? I didn't get a chance to answer the senator's question. We have increased staffing at the mail facilities 20%. We have trained all our canines in detection of fentanyl. We have, working with the U.S. Postal Service, increased advanced electronic data on shipments from China to well over 65% now from less than 10% the year before. We've increased our seizures of fentanyl in the mail facilities based on that targeting data over 150% last year, and we're going to continue to stay passionate and focused on that mission.
Commissioner, I want to thank you for all that you do to keep our country safe and to enforce our laws. My maternal grandfather was a U.S. Customs agent, and I appreciate greatly those who are willing to put themselves in difficult, awkward, sometimes very dangerous circumstances in order to do that. There's been a lot of confusion and some controversy over the supposed composition of these recent caravans. The president has insisted that the caravan includes some very bad actors, while a number of people, including some commentators in our news media, have insisted that it's largely, or at least substantially, composed of women and children. So could you set the record straight for us? Does the caravan include some dangerous criminals? And to what extent do you believe it poses a potential threat to our national security?
Thank you, Senator. The caravans that we've seen formed from the mid-October in Honduras, coming to the United States border, are different in many respects. The prior caravans, we saw the Via Crucis caravan, which happens annually in the spring. It's religiously organized. It's primarily about awareness. Only 300 members of that caravan even ever reached Tijuana and the U.S. border. This group was different from the outset. Its size overall, its composition is primarily single adult male in composition, over 60%. And unfortunately, the tactics that we saw them use at 3 international borders now, the way they entered Guatemala, assaulting the Guatemalan police and pushing past them despite them explaining that they would get a chance to lawfully enter Guatemala, the way they assaulted Mexican federal police at the southern border with Chiapas, including throwing rocks, dismantling border infrastructure, and ultimately crossing the river unlawfully, and then pushing past them again in southern Chiapas when the federal police had asked them to regularize and register their presence in Mexico before moving further. And then, of course, the events of November 25th. Same group, same aggression, same type of tactics. This was a concern that was noted when it formed, when they entered Guatemala, and that's why we responded and requested assistance from DOD to make sure we had the right preparations in place to prevent a mass rush of our ports of entry and to help make sure we can maintain security and safety of all involved.
So based on on its composition and based on the behavior of the group, you can't look me in the eye and say this group poses no threat.
They clearly do. They demonstrated it again 2 weeks ago.
One of the things that concerns me is I look at what we're able to do with scarce resources, with the personnel we have, and it's quite remarkable. In some ways, I worry that we might be asking too much of you, in that at times you face an overwhelming onslaught of those who are wanting to break our laws. We have to re-examine from time to time whether or not there's something about our laws that is encouraging this. And so I'd ask you what you would have in mind to do that, and I'd like to specifically raise the idea of a safe third country agreement. Tell us whether you think that might be something that is helpful. I've spoken to a couple of officials in the outgoing and now in the incoming Lopez Obrador administration in Mexico. Wanted to get your thoughts on a safe third country agreement.
So in studying this issue for years, I've been to refugee camps in Turkey. I was at the border between Norway and Russia where they had 5,500 folks arrive from 38 countries over a 2-month period back in 2015. It's very clear that whether it's Chancellor Merkel negotiating with President Erdogan or what Norway and Russia were able to achieve, that alignment of policy for asylum seekers between the destination country and the transit country is a very effective technique to address a regional phenomenon like this. Not the only thing, but it's an important step. I wouldn't presume to know the position of the incoming administration on this. Again, I would defer to the diplomatic level for ongoing discussions. But I think what you're seeing from the AMLO administration is a commitment to address regional migration flows. One of the first acts of President Lopez Obrador was to propose a significant aid package for Central America to address poverty, especially in the western highlands of Guatemala.
About 450 million, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a welcome partnership and investment, and I think will augment a lot of the U.S. efforts that are ongoing. But absolutely, you have to partner with transit countries to address this. You can see that in our own Safe Third Agreement with Canada, where people that cross between the ports of entry are returned to apply for asylum in the safe country that they're already in. It doesn't apply, however, between ports, and so we actually see a northbound flow between ports of entry going into Canada the last 2 years. Surprising development. So it's an interesting issue, and international agreements are a critical tool to address migration flows.
So one approach to it might be a safe third country agreement whereby if someone's coming through Mexico en route to the United States, they would have to apply for asylum with the Mexican government. A related but analytically distinct solution would be an agreement requiring those crossing through Mexico en route to the United States intending to apply for asylum in the United States to remain in Mexico during the pendency of their asylum application. Would you regard that as a comparably good outcome as a safe third country agreement? How do those two relate?
Yeah, I think the way you put it is perfectly appropriate, Senator. Related but analytically distinct. They're both covered in Title VIII of our immigration laws as options for partnering with foreign governments on migration flows, and they're both things that we should think about and discuss. And
neither would require a change to current statute?
No.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Feinstein. Thank you very much for being here, Commissioner. So my country, as you know, my country and our state has a proud tradition of refugees, and I'm not going to really focus on that today, but I just wanted to bring that up again because for a state like ours, which is an unemployment rate at 2.8%, and part of our employment workforce has been the Somalis and the Hmong and the Liberians and the refugees coming in. So we're very concerned, not just for that fabric of life in our state, but also on the employment front, because these are legal workers after they get here. And we're we are very concerned about losing that workforce. So I just want to put that on the record here. So on the asylum front, could you speak to why it's important to adjudicate the asylum claims of individuals are fleeing violence in an efficient manner? And one of the things that concerns me is when we did the comprehensive immigration bill in 2013, we have tens of billions of dollars, as you know, in that bill. I think over $40 billion for border security. That was for everything from the fencing to the personnel, and for things like the holding facilities, things you're talking about could have been used for. So could you talk about any steps to increase the capacity of the holding facilities in light of what we're seeing with the migration of people up?
Sure. First of all, would emphasize your point that adjudicating asylum claims completely and expeditiously is a much better approach. Right now, we have so many claims that frankly, it's overwhelmed the system. And CBP is just the front end of that process. Either folks that we apprehend crossing illegally who make a claim, and again, they can make a claim not just to CBP, but later in the process to ICE, an affirmative claim to CIS in their immigration proceedings, and then those folks arriving at ports of entry. As I mentioned in some of the prior dialogue, we've increased our asylum seekers at ports of entry, our ability to process them dramatically over the last year, and again, the first 2 months of this year, processing even more.
Okay. I need to have more questions, so
okay.
Answer. So you are increasing it. Would it be, do you think there's other things you can do, and would it be helpful if we had comprehensive immigration reform, then you could have some of those resources?
I think one of the keys is investing in the entire immigration continuum and the ability for ICE to process, to pick up from ports of entry is a key part of that, as well as our CIS asylum seekers.
The border separation policy, which has since been changed, and my mind was so heartless having been down there and spoken with some of those families. Do you have any regrets about how the family separation policy was implemented?
So, I think that law enforcement operations, even well-meaning law enforcement measures that are designed to protect people, to secure the border, if they lose the public trust, they can't be effective. And I think that was a challenge in this case.
Thank you. In a statement on June 23rd, the Department of Homeland Security said there was a central database of the location of separated parents and children, but a recent report by the IG Department's Inspector General found no evidence such a database exists. Can you explain the discrepancy?
My understanding was that was a comment by Health and Human Services about their unaccompanied child portal, which does have a comprehensive view for their system. But no, there are multiple systems maintained by different agencies in the continuum, and they need to be integrated and talk to each other more efficiently.
Thank you. I know in some questions from Senator Durbin, you mentioned the bill that Senator Portman and I just passed, the STOP Act, which will help your agency to crack down on illegal shipments of things like fentanyl by requiring them to provide the Postal Service electronic advanced data. I appreciate the administration's support for the legislation. Can you provide an update on the implementation of the STOP Act and describe how additional authority will help the CBP to interdict these shipments?
Yeah, thank you. I think, Senator Portman, your focus, Senator Klobuchar, on this issue has been very beneficial. Our partnership with the U.S. Postal Service has deepened dramatically over the last 2 years. I've worked very closely with Megan Brennan, the Postmaster General. They are committed to expanding the advanced electronic data coming from China and other key countries in this effort to counter fentanyl shipments. So we've made great progress. I mentioned some of those very quickly in response to Senator Durbin's questions. Our targeting based on that advanced electronic data has yielded dramatically increased seizures at JFK International Mail Facility. We've been able, working with ICE, HSI, as well as the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, to follow those seizures through to the pill presses in the U.S., everywhere from Manhattan to Washington State, to take down not just that individual shipment, which could be a 25-gram vial, but also the entire network that's producing the drugs.
Okay, very good. And I also have a northern border question about an area in Minnesota that's kind of off the beaten track. It's trying to do their best, and I'll ask that on the record because my colleagues have questions. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Commissioner, welcome. Mr. Commissioner, can we agree that legal immigration is good for America?
I have no disagreement with that point.
Okay. We welcome, what, about 1 million people in a year legally?
That's my understanding.
Can we agree that illegal immigration undermines the legal immigration system?
I agree with that point as well.
How so?
Well, first of all, it's very unfair to folks that have been waiting for visas, waiting for an immigration process to have the line jumped, if you will, by people that are crossing illegally.
Okay. Other countries have border walls, do they not? Well, let me back up. When we talk about border walls, we're talking about actual wall, fence. We're talking about a way of securing the border. Is that correct?
Yes, we look at it as one of the 4 critical capabilities for securing the border, having that ability to impede or deny access to a certain area of the border to people trying to cross illegally.
And every country has a border, is that right?
That's my understanding. That
kind of the definition of a country.
Right.
Agree with me? Okay.
It's central to sovereignty.
Yeah. Does every other country protect its border, or is there any country that says, hey, come on in, this is the price is right, come on down?
Well, they have varying degrees of resources, obviously, and varying degrees of people trying to enter. But yes, that is a international principle. 2 UN Security Council resolutions in the last year and a half on this topic, encouraging countries to do better at determining who's crossing their borders and sharing information about threats.
Okay. The nation of Israel has a border wall with the West Bank, does it not?
Yes.
Has it worked?
I've been there. I've seen it. It's worked very effectively.
Okay. Saudi Arabia has, what, an 1,100-mile border wall with Yemen, does it not?
I haven't been to that border, but they have invested heavily on increasing their border security, including infrastructure, the last several years.
Has it worked?
My understanding is that that's a big and challenging border, so it's not perfect, but I think it's improved their security in key areas.
Okay. Hungary has a border wall, doesn't it?
Yes, I believe so.
Has it worked?
My understanding is it helped prevent Hungary being part of the route of migration in 2015 and 2016.
Bulgaria has a border wall too, doesn't it?
I don't know about Bulgaria as well.
Okay. The Saudis are building a border wall with Iraq, 600 miles. Why are they doing that?
I think they realize that investing in security infrastructure helps create a better security environment between countries and hopefully drive folks to the lawful means of entering and leaving.
Okay. Now, we don't know everything about everyone who tries to come into our country illegally. I think there's some people that that are looking for a better life. And in an ironic sort of way, it seems to me, it's almost a compliment that we have so many people that want to come to America. Have you ever heard of anybody trying to sneak into China?
Well, yes, on their border with North Korea, but I think we have a very attractive society, and our economy is so strong. We did a study with USC, University of Southern California, recently that identified the huge wage gap between the United States and the countries in the Northern Triangle as being one of the key elements attracting the migration flows we're seeing today.
And some of the people that want to come into America are worried about getting killed in their own country, right?
Correct.
Are some of the people who want to come into America illegally terrorists?
Yes.
Are some of them drug dealers?
Of course.
Are some of the people who want to come into our country illegally gang members?
Yes.
And how do we know who the folks are that are in good faith trying to come in illegally versus those who represent a national security threat? How do we know the difference if we don't stop them?
Well, that's our goal, is to identify and interdict all illegal crossings and to carefully assess who we've encountered. That's part of why we share information with the FBI and other agencies, with HSI and their anti-gang efforts.
I'm about to run out of time. See, here's what I don't understand. We're a nation of immigrants. We ought to be proud of that. Legal immigration makes our country stronger. I think, for example, Japan is waking up to that fact as we speak. But illegal immigration is illegal. I'm thinking about introducing a bill. Illegal immigration is illegal. And if you support legal immigration, don't you have to oppose illegal immigration? Don't you?
It would stand to reason.
I mean, it's based on the rule of law, is it not?
Right.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. We are a nation of immigrants, and illegal immigration that undermines our country is certainly to be opposed, but a wall is not necessarily the most effective means of stopping illegal immigration if it is truly immigration by criminals or others who pose a danger to this country. Would you agree?
I actually think that good border security requires balanced investments to include a wall system, but also technology, agents, the
just
whole.
A wall for a wall's sake, if it is an ineffective form of a wall, if it doesn't have technology, if it is not accompanied by other means of security, is likely to be ineffective. And conversely, effective security can be done without certain kinds of physical obstacles, correct?
Yes, and that's why we've built our requirements for border security, including the wall system, from the ground up. From our agents in the field, our sector chiefs have requested capabilities, impedance and denial capabilities in different parts of the border. We have not asked for a wall system for all 1,954 miles, only where it would be an effective part of an integrated border security strategy.
Let me talk to you about an integrated border security statute. Should it include active duty American troops?
Not ultimately. I believe the border is a law enforcement mission, border security.
Did you request National Guard at the border?
Yes. CBP, all of our current DoD requests for assistance are driven by our operational requirements within CBP, and DoD has responded to those.
Did you request active duty American troops?
We requested specific types of capabilities. The Department of Defense decides which parts of their forces are most readily available and effective for that mission set.
Did you request a specific number of American troops?
We requested capabilities.
You didn't request a specific number?
No.
Who made that decision?
The Department of Defense.
Who requested the Department of Defense to make that decision? You did, or the President?
Those requests were generated by CBP, by our operational personnel who needed support with engineering, with transportation, with logistics, with medical, and ultimately force protection. They went up through the Department of Homeland Security and over to the Department of Defense where they were assessed and responded to.
Let me ask you about a memo that you sent on April 23rd, 2018, along with other officials to Secretary Nielsen. It was entitled, Increasing Prosecutions of Immigration Violations. Your memo has been made available by the Freedom of Information Act, and it argues that the Department of Homeland Security could, quote, permissibly direct the separation of parents or legal guardians and minors, end quote, in order to facilitate the separation of parents and children. The memo advocated for prosecuting, quote, all amenable adults who cross our border, including those presenting with a family unit, end quote. The public version of the memo is heavily redacted, but the Washington Post has reported that the memo argues that family separation is, in the Post's words, the most effective way, quote, most effective, end quote, way to deter asylum seekers from entering into the United States. We now know that this memo was critical in providing guidance in that policy, the zero tolerance policy, and resulted in the government ripping children away from their families when they posed absolutely no risk to children. When you wrote that memo, did you intend for the government to systematically separate parents from their children?
This memo was written in the context of the April 6 executive order on ending catch and release, the April 6th announcement of zero tolerance for immigration violations from the Attorney General, and was requested as a set of options for how to implement increasing prosecutions for immigration enforcement. At that time, we were seeing an increase in family units crossing the border. We had a whole category of adults crossing the border violating the same law as single adults who were not subject to prosecution.
So I apologize for interrupting. You did intend the policy to result from that memo.
We intended to provide options for increasing prosecution of adults violating the law crossing the border.
Which included separation from their families.
Actually, 20% of the adults prosecuted that crossed with children were never separated. They were only away for a few hours from their children and were reunited. The focus was on prosecuting adults violating the law.
My time has expired.
Senator Ono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Commissioner. Good to see you. You and CBP have a big job, and much of what you do involves enforcing customs laws and has nothing to do with immigration. In fact, I've worked with you in the past over some of these kinds of other responsibilities you have, particularly at our airports. So what we're focusing on, though, is that there are a lot of parts of what CPB does that do raise legal, constitutional, and humanitarian concerns, and that is everything involving people coming through our southern border. And I just want to note for the record that there are some 12 million undocumented people in our country. I would say most of them are providing needed labor, including, by the way, at one of President Trump's own golf courses. So it's one of the reasons that comprehensive immigration reform is very necessary. You have said that you support President Trump's border wall. And as the head of CBP, have you seen any plans for the president's border wall?
So CBP has developed those plans and those requirements based on specific segments of the border where we need impedance and denial capability to prevent people from crossing.
So you're talking about a physical barrier, aren't you?
We're talking about a physical barrier combined with sensors, cameras, lighting, and access.
So how many miles have you identified as needing physical barriers, not the sensors, not the technology, but physical barriers on our southern border?
In terms of the full requirements,
yes,
as we understand them today, about 1,100 miles.
1,100 miles. And of that designated areas, those miles, how many of those miles does the United States actually control the land that would be affected?
I can get back to you on that, Senator. I don't have that in my
I can tell you it's a very small percentage, which means that for most of the 1,100 miles, which you have designated as requiring a physical border of some sort, is actually in the hands of private owners, which means that in order to build this wall in the way that's being contemplated, you would have to engage in some sort of process. Generally, it's eminent domain process to get access to these lands. Do you have any calculation on how long such a process would take? Especially when you're talking about lots of landowners in Texas and other places who will be forced through eminent domain to give up their property for this wall to be erected.
So the property acquisition aspect of building border wall, it is significant and involved. It takes many months. It involves working, consulting with stakeholders, communities, and landowners. It involves requesting rights of entry to do a survey.
Yes, I am pretty familiar as to what would be required under an eminent domain proceedings, and sometimes it could take years, and you could have landowners who just will refuse to cooperate and refuse to give up their land, in which case you would have to come up with some kind of alternative B. So I think one of the things that really we should focus on is the reality of building 1,100 miles of physical barriers and what it would take to successfully engage in eminent domain proceedings. That's something that I don't think the president particularly focused on or even thinks about. You've previously also suggested that you support family detention, and of course CBP plays a key role in sending families to detention centers, and CBP is the first point of contact, and I realize that after CBP they go to ICE, but I think you testified that you have a partnership with ICE in the immigration continuum. So how many parents and children are in family detention centers currently?
So ICE has capacity for about 3,300 at any given time. They have about 2,500 families at family residential centers.
2,500. Do you know how much it costs to keep families in the detention centers?
I don't.
Well, one report said that 2019 congressional budget justification estimated the cost of family detention beds to be $318, almost $320 per day per family. By contrast, the Family Case Management Program, which the Trump administration terminated in July 2017, was about $38 per day. And I believe that you said that you did not think that alternatives to family detention would work. Can you tell me on what basis and what justification you have for that conclusion?
So I would defer to the ICE testimony, including by Deputy Director Albans at this committee in July, where he discussed alternatives to detention, including the Family Case Management Program. From my perspective, from a border security perspective, when we apprehend families and they're either not detained at all, which is the majority now, or they're detained for just a short period of time and aren't kept together through the entirety of their immigration proceedings, it creates an incentive for other families to cross. And that's what we're seeing today at our border.
Well, I'd be very interested to know how many families, how long of the, I don't know, some 2,500 or so who are in family detention centers, how long they stay there, and whether alternatives would work, because there's evidence that these much more cost-effective alternatives do work.
Senator Harris.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner, there's been a lot of talk about the use of tear gas in November, and my question is, there have been public reports, I believe it was from Patrol Chief Agent Rodney Scott and then you today, that you are conducting an internal affairs investigation. Is that correct?
It's called the use of force review. It is aided by our Office of Professional Responsibility. It's not an internal affairs investigation with an assumption of misconduct, though.
Okay, but you are investigating what happened.
All of our uses of force are reviewed.
Okay, and so to be clear, you've said in your testimony today that you will approach it and in the findings with transparency. So specifically, will you commit to making all of your findings public and available to this committee?
We have a process after a use of force review board is complete about publishing findings from the use of force review board, whether there's tactics, training, procedures that have been identified for improvement. And yes, I'll share that with the committee.
Okay. And were your agents wearing body-worn cameras during this incident? I know that Chief Agent Scott has mentioned that there's a lot of video from the incident.
Yes, obviously there was a lot of cameras out there. Both, open source media has a number of videos mostly from the south side. We do have imagery from our fixed cameras on the border, some from air assets. We're packaging all that together.
About body-worn cameras?
Very dynamic. No, we actually did not have body-worn cameras deployed with these agents, but we're actually the first federal agency to pilot the use of body-worn cameras. We're expanding that now into operational deployments.
And I want to commend you for that, because I know that you conducted a feasibility study in 2015. You found that CBP could benefit from body-worn cameras, and I commend you for your leadership on that, and I agree with your reasons. Also, can you please then, as a follow-up to that point, commit to providing us with a written update on your progress in implementing the body-worn cameras pilot?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. As you have acknowledged, and there's been discussion, again, regarding the November 25th incident at the San Ysidro Port of Entry, you know, and there's been discussion this morning, that that port sees 73 million border crossings a year, and it's at the heart of over $250 billion of annual gross regional product from San Diego and Imperial counties and neighboring Baja California. So my question is, I appreciate the security concerns that you've expressed and that existed at that time. But what I want to understand is, why did the closure require up to 5 hours of closure? Why that long? And given your agency's mission, and in particular to also facilitate legal trade and commerce, how did you weigh the harmful effects on commerce?
Sure.
Against your concerns about security?
Very important question, Senator. I could not agree more. It's an economic engine for that region of California and more broadly around the country. I personally wrote into our operational plan the need to maximize legitimate trade and travel while we made sure that any caravan arrival would be managed in a safe way. So I delegated that authority to the lead field coordinator in San Diego area. He made that decision based on what was presented to him in terms of intelligence from our Mexican counterparts, imagery we had about large groups still very active in the region for that full 5 hours. They actually opened it up a little bit before they felt that we had full resolution because they thought it was a secure enough situation, and they worked very hard to catch up on the traffic backlogs.
And the process by which that decision was made for it to be closed for that length of time, is that part of your review of the incident?
Absolutely. It has to be documented, the reasons for it, and the length of it.
And you can appreciate that there's a lot of concern in that part of our state from business owners, especially when the president has threatened to, quote, permanently close the border, that there would be real economic harm to that region. And so as a follow-up to that point, have you met with the San Diego area elected officials and the Chamber of Commerce leaders to get feedback from them of their assessment of the economic impact of these policies? And if not, will you commit to doing so?
I will, and I did speak with Mayor Falconer after this incident, and we're in touch almost daily with Sandag and the local Chamber of Commerce through our Director of Field Operations. Very concerned about the impact, and we'll definitely continue that dialogue.
Okay, and provide us with any documentation in terms of your analysis of what happened in looking in the rearview mirror, but also what improvements can be made to protocols and policy going forward and training. Shifting the topic, the President on November 27 declared that, quote, you have a lot of people that grab children at the border, suggesting that there are a lot of people who falsely pose as asylum-seeking families in an attempt to enter the country. Secretary Nielsen also told Congress that DHS was separating families to protect children from trafficking. You have stated that the CBP has identified 600, quote, fraudulent families in the past year. So my question is, how many of these cases has CBP referred for criminal prosecution, especially since Secretary Nielsen has repeatedly declared, quote, our policy is if you break the law, we will prosecute you? Because I have asked your agency for data on how many individuals have been referred for prosecution of trafficking, and I'm told you're not collecting that data, which seems inconsistent with a statement that this is a priority, that there will be a criminal prosecution if people violate and break the law, especially, I would think, our trafficking laws. So I'm attempting to reconcile a priority that apparently is the basis for separating children from what might be their parents. Absolutely, I appreciate that. So can you explain why you're not collecting this data and how it is that we can determine if trafficking is actually happening if there's no criminal referral for prosecution?
So we are tracking our criminal referrals carefully, and we can certainly designate that with the folks that have been part of a fraudulent family unit. So we'll share that with the committee as well.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner. Great to have you in front of us again. And I thought your lengthy submitted testimony, 15 pages, covered a very wide range of important and interesting issues. I'd love to follow up with you, for example, on trademark enforcement, counterfeiting enforcement, something that Chairman and I have a caucus on, and commend you on the work in automated commercial environment, ACE. But I'm struck, given the number of questions and the length of exchange with you about President Trump's insistence on funding and building a border wall, that in the 15 pages of testimony, you dedicate just one sentence to border infrastructure. Could you help me understand why President Trump's threatening to shut down the government of the United States when in an oversight hearing on the whole scope and reach of CBP's important responsibilities, you dedicate just one sentence to building physical barriers between our country and others?
I think I had a few more sentences in my oral testimony, and I knew it would be a topic of conversation during the dialogue at the hearing. So it is a critical tool for us. It's already making an impact. The miles we've built in El Centro and El Paso with the FY17 funding have dramatically reduced traffic in those areas. Over 70% in El Centro, over 35% in those areas of El Paso. It's a really important tool.
And to be clear about the testimony you've already given to a number of other members, you don't support and aren't advancing the idea of building a single concrete wall dividing the United States and Mexico, but rather a series of tactical systems that combine surveillance, monitoring, fencing, and wall systems. That's really what you've been advocating today. Is that correct?
Correct. That's what our Border Patrol agents in the field have asked for and need.
Well, it's my hope, I've supported investment in border security, but I think there's a significant disconnect between what the president has been advocating for and what I think has been your more nuanced testimony here today. Let me move on. The administration's travel ban that targeted predominantly Muslim-majority countries was something I strongly oppose, and I don't believe it makes us safer. I want to ask you about one provision of the travel ban proclamation, which says that CBP or consular officials can waive the entry restrictions on a case-by-case basis. How many waivers have been granted by CBP officials?
I'd have to get back to you on that, Senator. I don't have that with me today.
Do you know how many requests for waivers CBP has received?
I don't know that.
Could you provide a country-by-country breakdown and the reasons for granting or denying the waivers when you get back to me, please?
Yes.
I would appreciate that, Commissioner, because, frankly, a reading of the Supreme Court's decision upholding the travel ban clearly relied on there being a real waiver process. And my concern is that that process either doesn't exist or isn't effectively working. So please follow up with me in writing. I would appreciate that.
Will do.
And just to be clear, are individuals apprehended between ports of entry still being given the opportunity to seek asylum as the law requires?
Yes.
Thank you. Let me move to a last topic, if I could. Two things. The USA Act, which I introduced with Senator McCain in February, would have required a strategy for addressing root causes of illegal immigration from Central America to the United States, something championed by my predecessor, the former Vice President. Unfortunately, this administration continues to slash aid to those countries in its annual budget proposals. Would you agree that helping to improve stability, rule of law, safety conditions in the three core countries in Central America is a necessary component of border security?
I think working on the root causes and the push factors is absolutely essential. It's one of the key elements of an effective integrated strategy. We've got partners that we need to support in Central America, and I'm personally doing that with CBP's capabilities on a customs-to-customs basis, on a law enforcement and security basis, and also trying to support efforts of partners at USAID and elsewhere who are really trying to target their efforts at the key push factors for migration from the region.
Do you have any idea if the 2020 budget proposal will reflect the importance and significance of that ongoing and close partnership?
So the formation of that budget is not part of my responsibilities, but it's certainly a key element of an overall strategy.
I'll just say I'm struck that I agree. I think that is a critical part of a sustained key strategy. But it has to be sustained, and sustained at a significant level. And yet the last 2 years' budget proposals slashed that aid significantly. I think we're heading in the wrong direction. I commend you for your attention to that relationship. Let me last ask about the family separation policy. I'm glad it's been rescinded. I thought it was cruel to separate parents from children at the border, but I remain concerned about their treatment. When an unaccompanied child arrives at the border, one of the first questions a U.S. official asks is whether that child has a family member in the U.S. who could care for them. My impression is that CBP is sharing that information with ICE, and as we've seen, unaccompanied children spend more time in the care of our government or the custody of our government before they're released to sponsors. I have concern about how that information is being used. Can you guarantee information CBP obtains from these children to identify caretakers is not then being used to arrest and deport their relatives?
Give us a brief answer, Mr. Commissioner.
So what I can guarantee is that information we collect is available to our partners at ICE and HHS OR&R, which has the care and custody of children after that immediate period that they're at the border. I know that they're very committed to finding the right sponsor to place a child with.
Well, I'll just close by saying in September, a senior ICE official, Matthew Albence, told Congress more than 40 people who came forward as sponsors were arrested for having done so. And I'd be interested if you'd follow up in writing about in how many of those arrested it stemmed from information CBP obtained from unaccompanied children. There's so much more I wish we could talk about in this oversight hearing about the broad and important work that you and CBP do, but these are divisive foundational values issues. Thank you for your service, Commissioner.
The distinguished senator from Rhode Island.
Well, I thank the distinguished chairman from Louisiana.
You're quite welcome.
We coastal folk have to stick together.
Just a couple of distinguished guys.
Hey, first of all, Commissioner, thank you for coming in. I wanted to follow up a little bit with some of Senator Durbin's questions on fentanyl. What more can we be doing? This is such a scourge, and so much press attention and so much parent and management attention goes to border wall issues. I think a lot more Americans are dying because fentanyl's coming through our Customs and Border Protection system than because of people coming over our borders. So what more can we do to be helpful to you? You speak very generally about a few projects to try to improve mail surveillance in your testimony, but it seems like we're a long way from being close to an adequate surveillance and adequate intervention.
Yeah, I think there were some important developments in the last few weeks on this issue as well. It's been a priority administration-wide. You know, the president has a personal commitment to addressing fentanyl. I've seen that demonstrated. He engaged the Chinese president on scheduling fentanyl as a controlled substance, which really the Chinese government effort is going to be essential to addressing this, because so much of the production right now is in China, much of it illicit now, and so I think
I know you don't want to talk about ongoing investigations and prosecutions. I've been a United States attorney, and I understand that. But can you at least reassure me that there is a flow of cases being prepared for presentation to United States attorneys so that Chinese individuals who are responsible for shipping fentanyl into the United States are indicted under U.S. law? And can you give me some sense of how wide that thread of cases is? Is there like one out there, or is this really a serious effort, and can we look forward in the future to continued indictments of those responsible for firing fentanyl into our country?
I think it's a really serious effort, and especially given the vector in the mail facility that Senator Durbin started the dialogue on, getting the advanced electronic data allows us to bring in our investigative partners right away, HSI, U.S. Postal Inspection Service, not only to go after the network receiving that fentanyl and putting it in pill presses, but also in who's sending it, what are the companies on the side of China who are responsible for this, and how do we go after them?
Whatever order of magnitude you are comfortable, let's say to the nearest 20 or 50 cases, how many criminal cases do you think are in process focusing on the Chinese fentanyl delivery system?
I fear that my visibility would limit the overall federal government effort with HSI, DEA, the HIDAs out there around the country, all working this issue and very focused on it. I'm personally aware of a couple dozen cases.
Okay, that are coming out of CBP.
A lot of them generated by CBP seizures that are then being expanded to address the network, yes.
Okay. Back to the wall for a minute. We've heard repeated reports in the news about Customs and Border Patrol agents saying that we want a fence, a quote, fence that we can look through. That's what we need. Another one, you never want to have a barrier in place that will obstruct your vision. That seems like a pretty sensible, tactical concern for our folks to have along the border. It also seems inconsistent with the big masonry wall is the ability to see through and have situational awareness and visibility to the other side. Part of the reason that you're supporting this network of obstacles and surveillance devices rather than a C-to-C concrete solid barrier.
Yeah, it's an officer and agent safety issue to be able to have a transparent barrier so you can see threats from the other side. The President and the administration have supported the barrier that our agents are asking for that does include that capability.
And I don't know that we've got a plan yet from anybody for what is being asked for. We're being asked here in Congress to put a lot of money behind a, quote, border wall. I'm not accustomed to giving a contractor money for a project before I've seen the plan. You know, you roll it out and you look and you see it's going to go here, it's going to go there, it's going to be this high, it's going to require this much land to be condemned. Is there such a plan that you have seen for a solid border wall that actually is a real plan that a contractor could use to build off of?
So we have a plan, absolutely, a 33-segment, priority segment plan for building wall. The way we do our contracts through the Army Corps of Engineers, it's a multiple award task order contract where they compete it with American companies each time for each segment, and then it's 100% design build. So we specify the requirements, the contractors in the Army Corps come in and do the design.
So there's no place right now that a senator could go and say, roll out the paper and say, this is the plan for the wall from place to place? You'd have to grab different sections in which walls are being proposed. Is that what I understand?
Actually, briefly, Mr. Commissioner.
Okay, we can give the overall plan, and we can give segment by segment. For the plans under contract, we can show how it's being built and the exact design.
Okay.
In the FY18 funded.
I would like
and
to see
RGB.
that, because I think
We
there's
could
a lot of
demonstrate
concern that depending on how we build this, an enormous amount of private property could be taken from American citizens, from ranches and so forth, that it could interfere with the access of livestock to reach water, that could interfere with cutting off various facilities on the other side of the wall because you can't wall around an oxbow, for instance. There are a whole variety of concerns, and I'd like to follow up to figure out how we can see that.
Duly
Thank you.
noted. Senator Cruz is on his way. In the meantime, I'll start a second round for anybody that wants to ask questions. I've seen, I think, the plans you're talking about, Mr. Commissioner. Why does this wall / fence / barrier cost $25 million a mile?
It doesn't. It costs different amounts depending on the type of terrain that we're working in.
What's the average cost?
The average cost is a lot lower than that. I'll get that to you with precision now that we have a number of contracts underway.
Well, give me a ballpark. Surely you know an answer.
It's anywhere from 5 to 25 million, depending on the area of border that we're talking about.
Well, you drive on the interstate, don't you?
Indeed.
Have you ever seen those walls alongside the interstate?
Yes.
How long's how many miles of road, barriers, fences, walls are you planning on building?
We talked about, and this is a combination of primary barrier right on the border, some secondary barrier.
Right.
In a place like the Rio Grande Valley, we've got to contend
how
with
many?
The floodplain. About 1,100 miles total.
Okay.
We talked about.
Well, we built 2,700 miles of interstate barriers, walls, not fences, walls, for $4 billion. Now, I understand these barriers are different, but we spent $1.5 million a mile for the interstate, and they probably could have done it for less than that. So how come and I understand you've got to have some technology and sensors and all that stuff, but $25 million a mile?
So, Senator, there's a number of different factors. We are costing out, we want to present to Congress an accurate depiction of how much it's going to cost for this barrier. It's not just the physical, barrier itself. It's the property acquisition. It's the access roads to get to the wall.
We had property acquisition for the interstate, too.
And maybe you calculated that in the cost that you just offered on the interstate wall creation. But we have a fully loaded cost that includes all of those different elements, including the sensors and cameras. I would respectfully offer, and certainly we can get an expert briefing for you, Senator, for your team, that this is a different type of engineering project than a domestic interstate. I understand that. I just want to understand why it's, 10, 15, 20 times different. I just think you can sharpen your pencil and reduce the cost here and make this money stretch further. We've had a number of segments so far come in under cost on contract due to the competitive bidding process that we worked through the Army Corps of Engineers to put in place. Why don't we do something intelligent and try to change some money here, save some money here? We will absolutely continue to drive cost savings throughout the management of this program. Before I call on Senator Cruz, has the wall in San Diego worked? Absolutely. Has it worked in Yuma? Yes. Has it worked in El Paso? It's worked everywhere we've put barrier in, Senator. Do walls work? Yes. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, welcome.
Good to see you.
Thank you for your service, and let me say thank you to the men and women of CBP. I've been proud to spend a great deal of time with. The men and women you lead have an incredibly difficult job, an incredibly important job. They risk their lives on a daily basis, and let me say thank you for the important service you and the men and women you lead provide.
Thank you.
As you know, first 6 months of the Trump administration, we saw illegal crossings plummet. We saw apprehensions at the border plummet. And then since then, we've seen the numbers steadily increasing. To what do you ascribe that increase in illegal crossings?
The main factor, especially given the demographic changes we're seeing. Last month, we had over 59% of crossings were either families or unaccompanied children. They're predominantly coming from Central America now, almost 70% in November, and all of these trends are just steepening at this point. We attribute that to the understanding, the smugglers advertising it, and the migrants understanding that they come as a family, or if they claim fear of return, they'll likely be allowed to stay indefinitely in the United States.
So can you put some specifics on the numbers? What increase have we seen in family units crossing illegally?
So in June, well, actually, if you want to go back to April or March of the 17, when we saw that huge decrease, we had fewer than 10,000 people overall, and very small numbers of families coming in. For instance, family units in April of FY17 were 2,116. Last month was 30,154. So to put a specific fine point on it,
30,000 family units or 30,000 people in family units?
30,000 people in family units. That's how we count them.
How about unaccompanied minors? What have we seen on the numbers there?
So unaccompanied minors have been more stable, but have also gone up. We're seeing about 5,000 a month right now.
To what extent are y'all encountering either family units or unaccompanied minors who've been in the custody of human trafficking?
Almost exclusively. Human smuggling, we would refer to it.
And to what extent are you saying that these kids are being subjected to either physical abuse or sexual abuse in the process of being smuggled into the country?
A harrowing percentage, Senator, are being affected by sexual violence or other abuse in the process of their journey. Doctors Without Borders, independent, obviously humanitarian concern. They operate over a dozen clinics in Mexico. They've stated that 68% of the people they interact with have been victims of violence on the journey. 38% of women and girls sexually assaulted. So the figures are devastating, and it's not just U.S. government data. It's NGOs who are working with these populations to try to keep them safe.
So do you share my assessment that nobody concerned with compassion or humanity should want to see any little boys or any little girls in the custody of human traffickers or human smugglers?
Yeah, what's happening to some of the most vulnerable people in our hemisphere on this journey is deplorable, and we need to work with Mexico to address these TCOs. We need to work with Central America to address the push factors, and we've got to decrease the incentive in our legal system to invite these people into this dangerous cycle.
To what extent has the Flores settlement proven an impediment to dealing with this problem?
Well, in 2014, when we saw the first family surge, then Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson was able to detain families together through an immigration proceeding and start removing them once we saw the stark trend. That created a huge deterrent. Immediately, the numbers dropped of family units crossing. In 2015, a district court in California ruled that unaccompanied children, even if they have a parent with them, could not be kept in federal custody more than 20 days. That's not long enough for an immigration proceeding with due process, which is our commitment. So as a result, we've seen family unit numbers climb really unabated, but for the inauguration of President Trump in January 17. But as soon as the migrants and smugglers realized the laws hadn't fundamentally changed, we saw the families start to increase again to this level of 30,000 last month.
What additional tools does CBP need to be able to effectively secure the border?
So we have a border security improvement plan that we've submitted to Congress. We're in the process of updating that. Border wall system is a fundamental capability for impedance and denial. We need more technology. We need better sensors for our air and marine operations. And of course, we need agents and officers. Also, we need technology at the ports of entry to address the counter-narcotics efforts that we're trying to undertake there and get more vehicles and trucks through that screening as they enter Texas, as they enter the stream of commerce in the United States. So really, we need that all four things in an integrated strategy.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Feinstein, do you have additional questions?
I do, if I might. It's my understanding, I've been trying to read the OIG report, and It's my understanding that in September, the DHS IG found that hundreds of separated children were detained by Border Patrol for longer than 72 hours. My staff has visited the El Centro Border Patrol station in Imperial and found children sleeping on floors without access to water and basic hygiene products. So the question is, what steps are being taken to be sure that these kinds of situations are cleaned up and not permitted to continue?
First, Senator, there's no area of our operations that's more aggressively managed than the care of children in our care and custody and their transfer as soon as possible to Health and Human Services. I get a twice daily report on the number of children in our custody, how long they've been there. I've assigned my chief operating officer to work on a daily basis with Health and Human Services to ensure that they're able to grant placement for any children in our custody as expeditiously as possible. And I mentioned in my opening statement the mismatch
Well, you're not
between
saying that this didn't happen, that my staff didn't see this.
No, I've talked about the fact that our stations were designed for the custody of adults, adults usually who had just committed a criminal violation.
What this is it questions whether that's working or not.
Well, we're working as hard as we can to take care of the children in our custody and transfer them expeditiously. If you go to a Border Patrol station or a port of entry today, you'll see, next to areas where we're designed to process single adults, you'll see diapers and baby formula and children's food. Right now at Paso del Norte in El Paso port of entry, you will see kids in the officer break room watching a movie and being cared for by officers. This is not a system that was designed for the arrival of kids and families and the numbers we're seeing. We've worked with Congress to request additional support for child medical care, child mental health and welfare for those arriving, even in that short period of time that we're interacting with these children. It's a critical area that we need to continue to improve.
Well, for just a minute, what would you improve first and by how much?
So the first thing I would do, and the thing I'm most worried about, and we talked about in our last meeting a bit, is the fact that under the very important TVPRA, which sets standards for treatment of children, I know you were instrumental in authoring that legislation, Senator, the ability to repatriate kids from contiguous countries, Mexico and Canada, is there, and we don't see really any flow of UACs that is unmanageable from Mexico. From Central America, however, we're not able to do that repatriation, even working with Central American governments who believe that they have an interest in those children that are arriving unaccompanied. We really need to change that so they don't put themselves in the hands of smugglers. Their parents don't pay smugglers to bring them to the U.S. to even enter the cycle in the first place. I think that would be the most effective step we could take. We would have to modify the law, Senator.
And in what way would we have to modify it?
Well, I believe you could modify it to apply the same standards for repatriation of unaccompanied children that you apply for Mexico and Canada.
Well, I'm going to take a look at that, and I'd ask if you'd work with us.
Absolutely would, Senator.
Supportive of that?
Yes. And at the same time, I want to make sure that we have the capability to care for children in our custody with the right medical and mental health professionals, and that we have the partnership with Health and Human Services to expeditiously transfer children to a more appropriate custody situation.
Well, I'm going to take you at your word, and I'd like to create this part of the legislative future, and would like to work with you in so doing. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to wrap this up, but a number of folks have been to the border. I know Chairman Grassley has. He's told me before that he's seen our kids there with beds and food and supplies and care, but I want to kind of cut to the chase here. You and your agents care about children, don't you?
Absolutely.
Aren't you doing the best you can to try to treat them with kindness and with respect?
Our agents and officers are parents themselves. They don't check, as Chief Provost noted in this committee, their humanity at the door when they put their badge on. They absolutely care for those families and kids.
Yeah. You folks are just kind of overwhelmed, aren't you?
The whole system is overwhelmed.
And a lot of it has to do with the number of people seeking asylum.
Correct.
I think it's gone up, what, 10, 100? 5 years ago, 1 in 100 persons sought asylum. Now it's 1 in 10?
Yeah, it's actually even higher than that. Last year, it's 15 to 18%, and 31% of those arriving at ports of entry without documents.
Now, in your experience, are we just having more people who deserve asylum come, or do we have more people trying to gain the system, or do we have both?
I think we have people who might not understand what a meritorious asylum claim is. If you ask the Executive Office of Immigration Review that manages the immigration courts, they'll tell you that folks from the main countries of origin are only getting asylum at the end of their process 10 to 20% of the time.
Okay. Last question. Did President George W. Bush send troops to the border to help with immigration?
Yes, we also had help during the Obama administration from Department of Defense.
President Obama sent them too?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I think that's everything we have. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you.
Let's see if anybody has additional questions for the record. I expect many of my colleagues will. The record will remain open for 1 week. Thank you again, Mr. Commissioner, for sharing so much of your time with us today. The hearing's adjourned.
My honor. Thank you.